Hello, this week we're going to be talking about two aspects of medieval Christianity in the Latin West. One is about reform movements that happened in the 11th and 12th century, and the other concerns the crusades that were held during this time period, and we're going to be focusing specifically on the First Crusade. In many ways, the reform movement and the crusading movement are linked, and I hope we can see some of those connections as we go through these videos. One of the things that people often don't do is associate the word reform with the Middle Ages. Often people think about reform as something that happens after the Middle Ages, in the 16th century, and they associate it with people like Martin Luther or John Calvin or Thomas Cranmer. But the church historically has always thought about reforms, and it's really an accident of history that we call one period in particular the Reformation, when really it's just one aspect of many reforms, although very consequential. So I want to orient you towards thinking about the Gregorian Reformation. And I have a map up on Populi that will once again help us orient ourselves to the region we're talking about and the various sort of dynamics on the ground. The Gregorian Reformation is named after Pope Gregory VII, who was Pope between 1073 and 1085 in the 11th century. But in many ways, the reforming energies begin a good generation before him in the early 11th century. But nonetheless, Gregory is a good person to focus on. One of the key features of the Gregorian Reform is a strengthening of papal power. And there's really a question on the ground, which is how do lay and ecclesiastical leaders share authority in Latin and Western Christianity? As you look at that map, you can see there's many different political entities on the ground in the West, and these political entities have their own relationships with the churches in their region. And so the question is, where is the locus or source of unity for the church when it's divided up among a whole variety of political, ethnic, and linguistic groupings? The papacy sees itself as a means of unifying the entire church, and it's going to have a real struggle with that throughout the Middle Ages, of getting various political and ethnic groupings all united under the authority of the Bishop of Rome. In some ways, this is never going to be a fully successful movement in Christian Europe. And we're going to keep on unpacking that over the next couple of weeks. One of the key markers of reform, then, is clerical celibacy. Now, the celibacy of monks had been obviously a feature from the very beginning, and this helped to distinguish them from what we would call secular clergy. The word secular here comes from the word seculum, or that is the Latin word for the world. And so clergy who lived in the world, that is in cities or towns or villages with a congregation, a parish, often these clergy, these secular clergy, are married. And there develops a shift around the 9th century for a bias towards fully celibate clergy. And there are a couple of different reasons for this. One is cultural. As we saw when we looked at the letter composed by Augustine of Canterbury to Pope Gregory, it was clear that there's a number of Frankish cultural practices that assume that the laws of Levitical purity found in the book of Leviticus, the Hebrew Scriptures, would also apply to contemporary Frankish clergy. Church leaders link this to ways in which, in Pauline letters, notions of the purity of the body of Christ is emphasized. We see this, for example, in Paul's letter to the Ephesians. So there's a bias towards thinking that there needs to be something pure about the church, and that because of a particular Frankish reading of the body, sexual relations by priests render them problematically impure. So they want to then have a celibate clergy. There's also theological motivations. As the doctrine of transubstantiation in the Eucharist emerges, which is the belief that the bread and wine become in their substance or essence the body and blood of Christ, that then makes these two elements highly charged. They're so holy that it becomes dangerous to approach them. And there's understanding, again, by reading the Levitical codes, that only celibate priests who are pure bodily can safely handle the body and blood of Christ. This then both shuts off access of the Eucharist towards lay people, especially receiving the cup, because of the problem of accidental spillage of wine. And that also then creates a shift towards a higher conception of the priesthood. So notions like ontological change at ordination, that is somehow that one's very nature as a human being is somehow altered when ordained, also begins to emerge in this time period. Finally, there is also political reasons for emphasizing clerical celibacy. Lay rulers, that is kings, dukes, etc., in local regions really want to enforce clerical celibacy because that enabled them to have control over local churches. Local churches often controlled territory, land, various sorts of holdings that could be profitable. And especially as you get to bigger and bigger church complexes, whether it's an abbey or a large regional church, the holdings of those churches also capture the attention of local powerful families. And they'd rather have the lay ruler and the local powerful families have a say in the appointment of clergy to a specific church so that they can receive portions of the revenue stream. The alternative would have been, with a married priesthood, is the development of a hereditary priesthood, which would have created wealthy and powerful clerical families. And so the lay rulers are trying to cut that off. What this means then is that often the land that bishops and other powerful clergy, like abbots, say, often are receiving land in these holdings after they're being deeded to them at ordination by the local ruler. So there's an attempt here to keep a delicate balance of power over who has access to what resources. So Gregory VII is very invested for all these reasons in creating clerical celibacy as a norm. So in 1075, he excludes non-celibate priests in Germany from Eucharistic celebrations. This proves very difficult to implement among married clergy because the implication is they would need to set aside their wives. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, which, by the way, is also where the First Crusade is called by Pope Urban II, that is a reforming council, and at that council, there's a ban on the ordination of the sons of priests unless they take monastic vows. So that canon that's passed makes it really clear that there is some kind of hereditary priesthood operating in this region of France, and that there is a drive to stamp this out. In 1123, at the First Lateran Council, that is a council of the entire Western Church held at St. John's Lateran in Rome, there is a decree banning clergy to live with either concubines or wives. 1139, at the Second Lateran Council, there's a further order to married clergy to now separate from their wives and do penance for having been married. And then finally, at 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, which is really the culmination of a whole reforming process in the church, there's a reaffirmation of celibacy for priests and penance for violating celibacy. This shows that there really is a 150 or so year long effort to stamp out practices of priestly marriage, of priests being partnered, married, having children. And that this was a custom that took a while to remove. One of the most successful things that helped eliminate this practice and makes clerical celibacy a norm is pressure from below. That is, congregants were concerned that their married priests would lose their authority to celebrate the Eucharist from bishops, and thus, by not receiving the sacraments of baptism, Holy Communion, and etc., that fear leads to local laity pressuring clergy to not marry or to put aside their wives. Often putting aside one's wife or concubine meant that the spouse or concubine would go into a convent and live the rest of her life as a nun. Children would also have to be provided for in various ways. Research has shown that the further away one was from the center of power in Rome, the greater clerical marriage was accepted. So the peripheries of Western medieval Christianity, England, Ireland, the Basque region of the Pyrenees Mountains between Spain and France, are all regions where we still see higher incidence of clerical marriage into the 13th century. Alongside clerical marriage was a concern by Pope Gregory and his successor popes to eliminate simony. Simony is the buying and selling of church offices or church positions. This is named after Simon Magus, who you might recall in Acts 18. He is a magician who sees Peter healing people and offers to pay Peter money so he could learn how to do the same thing. And Peter rebukes him. And so this conflict between Peter, who is representative of papal authority in the 11th century, and Simon Magus, who's representative of corrupt clerical practices, is a convenient way of talking about this problem. It's representative of the issue. So you might be curious, how were clergy paid in the Middle Ages? If you fulfilled the requirements of a church office or position, clergy would receive something called a benefice, or a payment. These often were paid quarterly or annually. And sometimes a clergy member would pay bishops or lay rulers to receive a benefice, that is payment that is associated with an office, without fulfilling the duties of the office. And so this is especially common in the case of cathedral benefices known as prebends. Someone who serves in a cathedral was sometimes called a prebendary. And so what clergy are trying to do is boost their income, essentially, by buying offices, giving back bishops or lay rulers a percentage of their benefice in order to reap the rest of it. This leads to a huge problem of absenteeism, because as one accumulates offices, one certainly can't go around fulfilling all the duties of all the congregations or positions one has been placed in. Sometimes you have benefice in a separate country or region even. This leads to a real crisis of pastoral care. And so a huge amount of energy is spent within the Gregorian Reformation stamping out simony and trying to improve pastoral care. This goes to show that this is not all just about power, but also asking, how are people best served by the clergy in a specific context? Okay, that's all for now for thinking about reform movements in general, or impetus for reform. And next video, we're going to talk about a specific issue of reform that's related to simony, which is called lay investiture. I'll see you in the next video.